Electricity prices have skyrocketed over the last 25 years at approximately 4 times the rate of inflation. Millions of unemployed South Africans, many of whom survive on a social relief of distress grant from government, are not able to pay for electricity and still afford food and shelter. According to Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Luke Sinwell, households are forced to decide between putting nutritious food on the table or lighting their houses at night. This has forced communities to use protest as the only way to end electricity price hikes. Professor Luke Sinwell joins us now to elaborate further on this matter. Prof, thank you. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I mean, it's just insane when we look at what we are talking about and the way that electricity prices have outpaced inflation over the last 25 years. What is the direct impact on everyday South Africans because of this?
Well, I think, the middle class is also starting to feel the effects of the increase of the inflation. If you look, you can obviously even experience as an individual in a household, especially if you're supporting a larger family. But then the effects on the working class is particularly acute. And these effects are as a result of the commodification of electricity in the post-1994 period. So there were protests over electricity, especially from the late 1990s, with the prepaid meters that were introduced, but also the increasing rate of inflation. And then there were pensioners in the townships already at that time, 25 or 30 years ago, that couldn't afford to pay the high rate of electricity. And oftentimes working class households pay about 20% of their income on electricity. So the important thing there is that one needs to see the price of electricity in relative terms. It's not only an absolute amount, but it should be considered relative to one's income. And for the poor and working class, it's become increasingly unaffordable.
Yeah, I know that you've done a discussion document on energy racism, and you focused on something called, within an area like Orange Farm. That's one where you've gone in, you've had a look. Perhaps you can unpack what energy racism means in a context like this, and further on, how does racialized economic structures shape who can access electricity and what resistance actually looks like?
Those are really good questions. So in that report, it's called Energy Racism, and that was produced by the Center for Sociological Research and Practice, and a group of us went into different working class communities to find out what was actually happening over a long period of time to working class communities. And basically, we define energy racism as the systemic exclusion of working class and mainly Black households from accessing clean, affordable, and energy that they can access like in a sustained period. And then one of the key things we noted was that the same communities that were dispossessed under colonialism and apartheid, so especially Black working class communities, villages, informal settlements, and townships were the ones who tended not to have sustained access. So those are the ones who were we call it in the report, a systemic targeting of Black working class communities who are forced to pay more for the crisis. So it sort of turns around the dominant discourse on the head. It turns it around because the dominant discourse suggests that poor working class communities are the ones who are stealing electricity and it's all their fault. Whereas we are saying in that report that especially the process of load reduction, which does explicitly, it's a policy by ESCOM that says that if a community is seen as not being able to afford, or if it is not paying for the electricity, then we're going to cut off the area. So oftentimes in our research, it also demonstrates that communities want to pay the amount, but they need to be able to afford it. So then if 60% of the community cannot afford it, then the entire community will be blanketed and will be targeted, let's say, for example, for load reduction for the 12-hour period, or it could be like in one of the areas we looked at in Soweto, the main area actually, Pimville that we looked at in Soweto, they didn't have electricity for 12 months until it was eventually installed before the elections. In 2024.
And you know, the reality is that it's not that this is not a government doesn't know this. They do know this. In fact, we've heard, and I mean, it's again spoken about in the papers today. It's not the first time that the minister has said this, but to quote him, electricity minister has explicitly acknowledged that South African electricity prices are unsustainable. He warns that the country is sliding into what he's called energy poverty, very much so along the lines what you've been talking about. And he said that many poor households are forced to choose between electricity and the basic necessities like bread. So what are we doing about this? When government acknowledges it's too high, people can't afford it, lives are being ruined due to it, and yet it stays. So let's perhaps maybe take a situation of what the minister is speaking about, and how do we rectify this?
The way you're putting it is exactly right, and your question is getting to the crux of the point. It means that government is acknowledging that there's a problem, but this doesn't actually solve it. And so far, and what we envision happening, especially given the shift further towards the right, that the policy of the government now shifting towards the government of national unity, is actually wanting more and more examples and policy around cost recovery, privatization, and putting profits before the people. So these ideas of, we want to address the problem, we're admitting the problem. It's like admitting that the problem is gender-based violence, and that this is an extreme issue, that it's affecting all South Africans. But the question is, what is the policy? What is the underlying policy to deal with gender-based violence, and in this case, to deal with electricity? Are we going to have electricity that is designed to serve the interests of working class and poor people, or will it be a policy that serves the interests of profits and corporates? So that's the key issue that we need to focus on, is the actual policy. And then we may not want to talk about it, but it's also the ideology. That's a question of ideology. Privatization, cost recovery, neoliberal capitalism, and market-oriented policies are the ones that were introduced post-1994. And now what the government is suggesting is that these aren't working. So we need new policies that serve and work in the interests of the people. Otherwise, we're going to have energy poverty and energy racism, and people won't be able to access electricity. And then undoubtedly, like you've been seeing in protests across the country, people are going to rise up and shut down the communities, because that's often the only way that they can be heard.
And that's where I was going to go to as we start to wrap this up, because I think the Tembisa electricity price protest was the most recent one to tell us that, it's a big problem, and this is a very massive issue within communities that is just going to, at what seems like, bubble over in a very dramatic way. And this is really the only way, in terms of protesting, that a community can get their grievances across. I mean, is the level of free basic electricity not sufficient for poor households? And perhaps there's a massive change that needs to happen through legislation and to try and help the poorest of the poor. But at the same time, you need to keep the energy and the lights on by people paying. So, we have to find that fine balance.
Yeah, undoubtedly, the amount of electricity that, poor and working class households are able to get for the money that they have, is unaffordable and unsustainable. And the only way to address that is to find a way to make it more affordable. Otherwise, the lights will be shut off if we keep the policy going, because people won't be able to afford to pay. If you can't afford to pay and you have to choose between food, getting to work, medical bills, and electricity, there's a good chance that you're going to find some way to bypass. And if that doesn't work, and an entire community, like we've seen in so many places, not just Tembisa, but across the country, from Khayelitsha to Soweto to Tembelhle in Lenasia, and then more recently, also last week, I saw in Chepitsong, which is an area on the West Rand, there was a similar problem of people simply not having access at all to electricity. So people were bridging. So people both need access to the grids. There's still communities, informal settlements, that don't have access to the grids. So they find ways of connecting to the electricity supply. So until people have that access and are able to afford to pay electricity, and they might not be able to afford, there's no way that they would be able to afford the same payment right now in the economic crunch that we're in, as middle class people or elite people are paying. So obviously we need to find a way that the resources, energy, its main drive is to serve the interests of 100% of the people who live in this country.
Yeah, well, we've heard comments from the minister. Again, I go back to them because this is what we can hold on to, is that after we saw these protests that we've been referring to, the minister basically mandated a full review of the electricity pricing framework through the South African National Energy Development Institute, and he's told households to expect big changes. An empty promise, or do you think that the minister will actually act on this?
It sounds to me very hopeful, and like we've heard these kinds of things before around a wide range of issues, from housing, water, electricity, gender-based violence. I'm just mentioning that one because it comes up as something that we're going to put in, major policy shifts. But then the question is, what is that, and how is it dealing? The key thing is it going to deal with the root cause, which is market-driven, neoliberal profits before people? And if not, what we're going to find most likely is, like you said, a bit of empty promises, some fiddling with some of the policies, but then we are going to eventually see, like we've seen for the last 25 years, this isn't the first time we've had protests over electricity. We're going to eventually get communities rising up in protest, because that is, like you saw in Tembisa, that is when the government comes and intervenes and then says, oh, this is actually a problem that we need to resolve.
All right, Prof, we have to leave it there. Thank you for talking to us. Thanks for sharing your insights into a topic that affects every single one of us, but certainly the poorest of the poor are really the ones suffering at this point. Professor Luke Sinwell, he's a Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, speaking about South Africa's electricity prices.